And I'm going to mute everyone. And so speakers will need you to unmute yourselves. Okay, so I'll just do a little welcome first, then we'll introduce the program and our speakers and get started. So again, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Eric Love. I am the Director of Staff Diversity and Inclusion, and this event is one of our ongoing speaker series. We had a Black History Month event a few weeks ago, and next week, well, actually in 2 weeks, March 17th, we have a Women's History Month event. It is another Lunch and Learn, Sins of Omission, Remembering Catholic Sisters on campus and in America. And it focuses on kind of a lost history of the Sisters of the Holy Cross and their role in Notre Dame and St. Mary's. And so we're looking forward to that. Also, today is Employee Appreciation Day. And so I would just, on behalf of HR and the university, all of you on here today who are employees of Notre Dame, thank you. Thank you so much for everything you do day to day, the big things, the big projects, the little things. Thank you so much. And in appreciation for all that you do, we've arranged for it to be 70 degrees tomorrow. And so you are welcome. So, at least that's what they say. The weather is going to be beautiful. All right, so this event today actually came together rather quickly. It started with a meeting that I had with Dennis Brownlee, who is the president of the African American Irish Diaspora Network, and Mary Hendrickson, our own Mary Hendrickson, who's an assistant director at Keogh Naughton Institute of Irish Studies. We had a meeting with Jim Rooney and with Jeremi Duru. And as that discussion went on, we started talking about some of the issues of the day, the Rooney Rule, recent lawsuit against the NFL, and then also came to mind President Biden's choice for a Supreme Court justice, and now how he wanted specifically an African-American woman. And so we thought we'd put together this event entitled The Rooney Rule, Intentions and Applications in Athletics and Beyond. And so our speakers here will talk about that and let's discuss implications beyond as well. We can take questions, but I ask that the questions come through the chat and then I'll refer them, I'll moderate and get those to the speakers. As always with our events, we want people to be respectful. One person talk at a time, keep muted if possible. Today I can mute you if I need to, but we want this to be very informative. We have some amazing speakers, and so we want to make the best of this. All right, so let me introduce our speakers. We have Jim Rooney is a published author, consultant, and national speaker. His book, A Different Way to Win. Dan Rooney's story from the Super Bowl to the Rooney Rule details his father's long and successful career, released in November 2019. The book quickly became the Amazon bestseller and was selected on President Obama's 2019 book list. He is a co-partner of Rooney Consulting, which assists organizations with enhancing culture, building strong teams, and growing their businesses. Additionally, he serves on the board of directors for the Jewish Healthcare Foundation of Pittsburgh, the American Ireland Funds, and Gilmore Academy. He is a 2019 recipient of the Lewis L. Glucksman Award for Business Leadership from New York University's Glucksman Ireland House. And we're so happy to have him here. He also has a good friend and partner in these discussions with him. And we're happy to also have Jeremi Duru. He is a professor, author, lecturer, researcher, and frequent media contributor and advocate, and is among the nation's foremost sports law authorities. Currently a professor of law at American University's Washington College of Law. He is also a counselor of sports industry professionals and organizations and is former counsel to the Fritz Pollard Alliance of Minority Coaches, Scouts, and Front Office Personnel in the NFL. Duru has authored and co-authored books on sports law and examining the NFL's movement towards increased racial equality. Duru is a member of the United States Anti-Doping Agency's Anti-Doping Review Board and the National Sports Law Institute's Board of Advisors. He has been a legal analyst for Yahoo Sports and provided commentary for numerous media outlets, including CNN, BBC, one of my favorite channels, NBC, MSNBC, Fox, ESPN, NPR, the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a very warm virtual Notre Dame welcome for our two speakers.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you so much. And Dennis, Mary, Eric, we deeply appreciate the opportunity to be here in a conversation with you all. You mentioned, Eric, during the run-up, the recent lawsuit against the National Football League. So I just kind of want to touch on that and talk about what I think is the real importance of the conversation we're having in light of that suit. So a former head coach in the league, former head coach for the Miami Dolphins, Brian Flores, has sued the National Football League and all of its clubs for racial discrimination. He sued them under state statutes as well as a federal statute. And in his suit, he identifies league-wide double standards and headwinds facing head coaches and executives of color in the league. And he also identifies what he believes to be unfair and racially motivated treatment that he received from three clubs, the Denver Broncos, the Miami Dolphins, in terminating him, and the New York Giants. And so the lawsuit itself is surprising because it's rare that an individual takes on a substantial sports league. It happens, but it happens rarely. And often when it happens, that person doesn't get back into the game. And so it's a pretty substantial risk. But the double standards he identifies in his complaint shouldn't be a surprise. The fact of a lawsuit may be surprising, but the double standards shouldn't be a surprise. The National Football League has a very fraught history with respect to race and racial discrimination, going back to the exclusion of all people of color in the league back in 1933, the re-inclusion in 1946, but the re-inclusion strategically, one might say, into non-quote unquote intelligent or leadership positions. So while Black players were allowed back into the league in 1946, they found themselves not playing middle linebacker initially or center or quarterback, and also not in head coaching roles or coaching roles at all. And that unfortunate NFL history is carried forward, essentially to the present, but there has been some progress. And I want to turn it over to Jim to talk a little bit about that progress. And ultimately we'll talk about where we are now and where we can go from here. But I want to turn to Jim now, because I just mentioned that Flores was terminated, and upon being terminated and suing, thought he might not ever work in the league again. And I also talked about the fact that after the reintegration of the league in 1946, Black players were essentially kept out of the quote unquote thinking positions. Well, the Steelers are ahead of the curve on race, on equity, on diversity in the league now, and they were then. So not a month after Flores was terminated, the Steelers hired him. Notwithstanding the fact that he was suing the league and all its clubs, which include the Steelers hired him, which was a groundbreaking moment, a moment that told people of color in the league, hey, you can stand up and do what you think is right, and it doesn't mean you'll be expelled. When Black players began in the 1970s moving out of just the brawn positions into the brain positions, the quote unquote brain positions, the Steelers were at the forefront there. Bring in a fellow named Joe Gilliam, quarterback for the club, who was the first Black quarterback to be named a starter before the season began in the NFL. in its history. And so we've seen the Steelers at the forefront. And it shouldn't be surprising that the Steelers leadership is necessary and important now. And the Steelers leadership really is grounded in Jim's father and the values he brought to the league. And so maybe, Jim, I can turn it to you to talk a little bit about your father's work in the league, and then we can move into the Rooney Rule concept named after him and where we are now with race, equity, and inclusion in the league.
It's only been 2 years and I'm still talking on mute. My wife wished she had a mute button 20 years ago. Before I answer sort of your question, I first want to also thank Eric. It's been great to work with you, even though it's just been a short while. Your leadership there is phenomenal, and it's important to me because I also have a history and am a steward of the Holy Cross legacy as a graduate of Gilmore Academy. So the charisms and the mores of the Holy Cross brothers are important to me, Holy Cross order. Dennis, I'm excited that we've talked for about a year about doing something together, and here we are at the, one of the greatest Irish Catholic institutions in the world, and so I'm excited about that. And Mary, I really have enjoyed the chance to speak with you and be part of this. I also would be remiss as a BC guy to say that I'm really excited, and then down the road we'll be frustrated with Coach Freeman, because I think Notre Dame is on its way back to championship football that we haven't seen for a long time. And you've certainly had some good teams over the last 15 years, but I think Marcus is going to bring Notre Dame back to championship level, and I'm really excited to see that and root him on, unless he's beating up BC. And I also have to talk about Jack Swarbrick. I know what my brother did. Mike Tomlin made the courageous move of hiring Coach Flores, but it would have been easy for my brother Art Rooney to say, let's not do it. When someone's suing your organization, bringing them in as an employee, it's just simpler not to deal with that. And so that leadership, Jack's leadership, to say, wait a minute, this is who Notre Dame is. These are the values of the Holy Cross, institution and Notre Dame, and we're going to step to the plate. It means a lot, and so I'm really excited to be a small part of that, and to be in a conversation that was so important to what my father's life and legacy were about. I guess I will also start with a little bit of the elephant in the room. So, since the lawsuit and the reasons for the lawsuit that Jeremy brought up, there's a lot of conversation about getting rid of the Rooney Rule. And my view on that is, I don't care if you replace it, amend it, leave it alone. I have thoughts on all three of those, but at the end of the day, if we're going to develop policies that work, they're going to need transparency, they're going to need accountability, they're going to need enforcement. And all of those things, I think, can be developed into the policies, but we can talk about how we do that more effectively. But then the fourth piece is more difficult, and it's why I mentioned, Jack there at Notre Dame, Mike Tomlin in Pittsburgh, my brother in Pittsburgh, is that it requires sincerity as well. And sincerity, I don't know, is something that you can process or put into a policy or a protocol. And it requires character and leadership to do that. So, that has to be part of the conversation, and it is the trickier one because it's harder to measure, it's harder to implement, but I do think it's essential. So whatever we do with the Rooney Rule, whatever the outcome is, if we're going to address the lack of leadership, and especially front-facing leadership, we're seeing a lot of growth at vice president levels, and those are important. But to have Mike Tomlin and Marcus Freeman as the face of your organization, that is saying something to someone who doesn't look like me. And it's saying to them, I value you at the ultimate level. You can be the face of my brand. And I think that's I think that's important. So to go to the start of, so that's my response to the Rooney Rule and whether we get rid of it or don't get rid of it. But to go to the historical context, which I think is important in this conversation. I refer to my father, Dan Rooney. My father took over the Steelers from my grandfather, who started them, who actually hired Lowell Perry back in 1949 as the first coach since Fritz Pollard and the ban on Black players and coaches in the 1933. Lowell Perry was hired as an assistant coach by the Steelers. And since then, my father then takes over the team in the late 50s, early 60s, and talks about, he's impacted by the civil rights era, and in the business plan, the updated business plan. My grandfather really never had a business plan. My grandfather was a great promoter, but the modern contexts weren't sort of how he functioned. So my father comes in, and in the Steelers business plan, he says, I want us to be one of the most highly integrated teams in professional sports. And that's great. And it gets all kind of applause and recognition. But the reality is he didn't know what to do, and he didn't do a great job for about the next 8 to 10 years. And there was a sports writer for one of the most highly circulated African-American papers in the country, the Pittsburgh Courier. By the way, that sports writer was the intern under Wendell Smith, who chronicled the Jackie Robinson story. So Bill Nunn, the gentleman I'm talking about, has a long history of dealing with revolutionizing sports with integration. So Bill comes in and is critical of Dan Rooney and says, Dan Rooney says all these things, but he's really not, the Steelers aren't different than any other team. And that really hurt my father. It really had an impact on him. But rather than, battling Bill or becoming defensive, he invites Bill in, and Bill was in Pittsburgh, so they had a relationship. And he said, Bill, help me do what I want to do. Help me change the course. And the idea that you're willing to go to someone different, who has a different experience, who has an understanding that is broader than what yours might be, have a willingness to take on criticism and say, okay, I'm not doing what I set my goals to be. How can I do that differently? And so this meeting with Bill Nunn really represented a sea change from saying the right things to doing the right things. And so Bill not only sort of lays some of this out in this conversation, but my father convinces Bill at this luncheon to come work for the Steelers. And from 1968 to 1980, the Steelers draft more players from the HBCUs, the historically Black colleges, universities, than any other team in the National Football League. And we were the worst. The one thing I didn't say is we were the worst team in sports from 32 to 72. I mean, we were horrible. We lost all the time. And Bill comes in and starts looking at pools of talent that other scouts aren't even going to. He understands, the strength. There's you still have significant segregation in the SEC and so many of the big schools in the South and in Texas. And so Bill understands this and understands where so many of these players are going to go to college and play football. And we start drafting them. And we bring in Hall of Famers, Mel Blount, Donnie Shell, John Stallworth. All these guys come in and transform the culture of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And that transformation doesn't just stop with representation. So, I think we all need to look at representation as the first step, but that doesn't get us where we want to be when we look at a Rooney Rule or real leadership positions. Jeremi talked about the decision by Coach Knoll to take one of these HBCU grads, Joe Gilliam, and make him the starter. And when he named him as starting quarterback, I've talked to Donnie Shell and Mel Blount, and they said that just meant so much to them because they understood at that point that decisions were going to be based on merit, not on skin color, race, anything else. But that if the best quarterback can be Black back in 1973, 74, then certainly the best safety, the best cornerback, whatever position, that opportunity is going to be there. And how that changed the sense of trust in the culture. And there was now a belief that, these ideas, these concepts of being welcome were not just theoretical, not just esoteric, but that they were happening and being practiced in a real way. You move forward and you get about 4 years later, the first Super Bowl championship team with Joe Green, Sam Davis, and Donnie Shell, who I've mentioned, as captains. It's the first time you have a Super Bowl championship team with 3 Black captains. You draft this young guy out of Minnesota named Tony Dungy, and Tony Dungy comes into that system with Bill Nunn already in a leadership role, with Joe Green as a captain, with Joe Gilliam having been named starting quarterback. Now, Terry Bradshaw went on to beat Joe out later, but this environment is the environment that Tony Dungy comes into. And Tony works as a player under Coach Knoll, and then is named the first African-American and youngest defensive coordinator in NFL history at age 29 under Coach Knoll. And Tony talks often about the spirit of what we call the Rooney Rule now, and that it was about embracing this idea of difference, of really respecting, not just the physicality of someone who looks different, but their brain, their spirit, the everything that is going to be brought to the table by another human being, that dignity was respected in this environment, and that he felt it was such an essential environment for him to launch his career. So Tony then, proves to be an excellent defensive coordinator, but is not getting interviewed, is not getting jobs when he does the interviews, does not getting the head coaching jobs. And my father sees this, and he knows how good Tony is. He'd set this culture up with his own team, but then he sees that people coming from that culture aren't getting opportunities across the league. And that really becomes the beginning and the humiliation. My father had emotional intelligence. He had an awareness of what this experience must be like, and felt like he had an obligation. We talk about the charisms of the Holy Cross at Notre Dame and at Gilmore. My father was putting those things into action in his life, and saw that in a very real and live way with Tony Dungy's experience. And so that was what really began to move the ball forward with the Rooney Rule. One last point on the Steelers. So you had this commitment to diversity. Since that time, since the 1970s, and I'm patting myself on the back here a little bit, really my father, but the Steelers have won more games, have won more championships, have sent more players to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. We're in a small market, a little bigger than South Bend, Indiana, but we're not that close to Chicago. We're in this small market, yet we have, like Notre Dame, a great national presence. We're the top every year in television ratings, in merchandise sales, in brand affinity. And the biggest differentiator in our business has been that commitment to diversity. And you see it today with Coach Tomlin. You see it with the decision to bring Brian Flores in. And it has been about doing the right thing. And I think, like Notre Dame, collecting fans from across the country and across the globe who are interested in someone doing the right thing. But it's also been a business advantage. We've been more successful because we've made this commitment, to understanding that diversity not only matters, is important, but it's effective. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the best thing to do. So Jeremi, maybe I'll turn it over to you. You talk a little bit about the technical side of the rule, and then we'll move forward with some Q&A here.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. So the good news is what the Steelers were doing. The bad news is that they were out in front. Most clubs were not following them when it came to the philosophy that Bill Nunn and Dan Rooney and the rest of the organization embraced. So at the turn of the century, you had a National Football League with 70% of the players of color, 32 clubs, and only 3 head coaches of color, one of whom was Tony Dungy, who grew up in the Steelers organization. But after the 2001 season, Tony Dungy, who had taken up the helm at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and had turned the team, anyone who followed football around that time knows the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at the time, now they're riding high. At the time, they were an absolute joke. I mean, they would have been beaten by a fair number of college teams. I mean, they were bottom of the barrel. And Tony Dungy comes in and he turns them around in 6 seasons to a Super Bowl contender, a championship contender. And after 2 straight playoff seasons, he gets terminated. Another head coach of color named Dennis Green with the Vikings, who's done a great job there, he gets terminated. So suddenly after the 2001 season, we're down to 1 head coach of color out of 32 clubs in a league where 70% of the players were of color. And it was just too much to tolerate for the civil rights community. So a couple of civil rights lawyers essentially challenged the league on race grounds. They put together a report. They went to University of Pennsylvania. They got a labor economist there to do a statistical study of head coach wins and losses going back 15 years from 2001, so back to 1986. We all know that wins and losses, that's the metric that matters in the National Football League. And so the labor economist compared wins and losses for the few Black head coaches who'd had the opportunity to coach in the league during those 15 years and the white head coaches. And in the first year with the club, Black head coaches won 2.7 more games than white head coaches. This is a 16-game season now. So, you run the numbers, 2.7 is a huge number in a 16-game season. And the year that a coach was terminated or left the position, Black coaches won 1.1 more games than white coaches. And overall, Black coaches were more successful, had better records, and as a percentage matter, went to the playoffs more often. So the conclusion was not that Black coaches are somehow inherently better coaches. The conclusion of the study was that Black coaches had been put in subordinate positions for so long, faced a glass ceiling for so long, kept at the system level for so long, that once they became head coaches, they were just better. They were more experienced, they had more expertise, and they were just better. So these lawyers, one is named Cyrus Mary out of DC, the other is Johnny Cochran out of Los Angeles. You may be familiar with him with respect to the O.J. Simpson case, where he was a defense attorney. But in fact, he was an extraordinary civil rights attorney. I don't think he gets enough credit for the work he did as a civil rights attorney. So these 2 attorneys took that report and essentially threw it in the league's face. In much the way that Bill Nunn told Dan Rooney some years ago, you think you're doing well, but really you're not. And the league, in response to the report being thrown in their face, and when I say the league, at the time, Paul Tagliabue was the commissioner, the general counsel, Jeff Pash is still in that role. Roger Goodell was then chief operating officer. They took this report in, and rather than play big time, highly capitalized defendant and essentially say, okay, you want to sue us, come and sue us, and we'll just kill you with 1,000 cuts with motions over the course of 2 years in litigation. They said, no, let's examine this. We know that we've got a problem when it comes to diversity. The numbers don't lie. Let's figure out what these lawyers have to say. And they invited a conversation. They brought the lawyers in. The lawyers, Cyrus and Johnny, brought with them a few former NFL players and executives of color who've been frustrated by the inability to climb the ranks in administration in the league for some years. Chief among those was a gentleman named John Wooten, who's probably the most influential person in the NFL that nobody's heard about. He's an extraordinary individual. He's played all the roles at all the clubs in the league office, knows everybody. Everybody picks up his call. So they brought in John Wooten, a few others, Kellen Winslow Sr., Warren Moon, Hall of Famers, and they sat down with the league. And over the course of a few hours, the league leaders recognized that they had to do something systemic going forward. Just one meeting wasn't going to be enough. And so what Paul Tagliabue, the commissioner, did, said, hey, I want to put together a committee. We'll call it the Workplace Diversity Committee. And this committee will attend to these issues of equal opportunity and diversity and inclusion. And I want to name Dan Rooney to chair the committee. And when the outsiders, the lawyers and these executives who had gripes, learned that Dan Rooney would chair this newly formed committee, John Wooten, who I mentioned a moment ago, told the group, hey, we've won this thing. And of course they hadn't won it, but they were on their way in John's view because Dan Rooney was named chair of the committee. And in the short term, there were wins. The committee headed by Dan Rooney got all 32 clubs to agree to this concept that before you hire a head coach, you have to interview a person of color. And that rule took the name, tribute to Dan Rooney's work on the rule and to his history in the league, took on the name the Rooney Rule. And that Rooney Rule had impact. So going forward, every team interviewing for a head coach had to interview a coach of color. Within 3 years, the number of head coaches of color went up from 1 to 8. The league was so bullish on the concept, they introduced it to the general manager ranks. And the numbers there went up from 1 to 6. Substantial increase. And the number stayed in that realm for a while, with year after year, Dan Rooney making sure that owners applied the rule when doing their interviewing. And John Wooten, working from the outside, made sure that the coaching candidates were coached up, were prepped for interviews, made sure that they mentored each other. There was a real pay it forward culture going on among the coaches of color in the National Football League. And so with John pushing on the outside and Dan pushing on the inside, we had these elevated numbers, certainly elevated by the standards of where we started back in 2001. But I'd say about 5 years ago, we started to see backsliding. And, Jim and I talk about this a lot. And I think that there are a few reasons for the backsliding that merit notation. One is that in 2017, Dan Rooney passed away. And so you had the kind of the moral voice and the hardest core advocate inside the league for this rule and for equal opportunity no longer in the picture. At that same year, John Wooten, who was the strongest advocate for equal opportunity outside of the league structures, kind of pushing on a watchdog basis, he announced that he'd retire. And so suddenly the flag bearers on the inside and on the outside were gone. And what that revealed was that the ethos of the rule had not bled into the fabric of the league, because with them gone, there appeared to be a vacuum. There were still people pushing on the inside and on the outside. I was an advocate on the outside pushing. Jim was on the inside. There are still people pushing, but with them gone, the shoes were hard to fill. And slowly you started to see clubs not attending to the rule in the same way. Feeling like, well, maybe we can cut corners. Maybe this interview doesn't have to be as robust as we're giving to the interview of the white candidate. Let's just get through this. Let's get our hire done. Let's move forward. And when that happened, and when the league was not, when the rule was not effectuated fully by a club, the league did not come in and penalize the club. And so you had a bit of a cyclical thing where clubs are now saying, okay, we see X club didn't really abide by the rule. The league didn't do anything about it. Maybe we can, hurry up and make our hire and not worry about this rule. And then the league doesn't do anything about that. And so we kind of had a downward a spiral. And so we found ourselves in a place where just this most recent offseason, before the last two hirings of the hiring cycle, we were back with only one African-American head coach in the league, Mike Tomlin, with the Steelers. What's important to note, and I think we should probably get to questions, we really want to open this up and get into conversation, but one thing that's important to note is that this Rooney Rule concept that has been effective in the National Football League in the early goings has been adopted widely outside of the league and outside of sport. The state of Oregon has a Rooney Rule for all of its public universities when it comes to hiring a head coach in any sport, athletic or an athletic director. The city of Portland, the city of Pittsburgh have Rooney Rule analogs where having nothing to do with sport. When we're talking about the civil service, if you're hiring, for example, in Portland, a new fire chief or police chief, you have to interview a person of color and a woman and a person with a disability, unless you can show that there is nobody in any of those three categories who has some baseline level threshold of qualifications for the job. Silicon Valley, Pinterest, Facebook, any number of other companies out there have a Rooney Rule analog. Nike's got a Rooney Rule analog. Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, they implement a form of the Rooney Rule. You go across the pond to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom soccer community, the Football Association is what it's called, that runs soccer in the United Kingdom. They have a rule where if you're going to hire a head coach for the men's or women's national team at any level, from the team you see playing in the FIFA World Cup all the way down to the U15s, U14s, you have to interview a person of color. And there are many other examples as well. And so I think it's important for us, as we move into questions and conversation, to think about both the successes of the rule in the NFL, as well as the failures of the rule in the NFL, if we want the rule to be effective in the other institutions in which it's implemented. There are lessons to be learned, and I think it's important that those lessons be learned, such that mistakes are not remade and the Rooney Rule doesn't suffer from some of the criticism in those other contexts that it has suffered from in the National Football League. So that's probably enough of Jim and I blathering on to you all. I think hopefully we've set the foundation for a conversation, and maybe I'll turn it over to Eric and we can engage.
Okay, I think what we'll do, initially I was thinking we'll take questions through the chat, but if you have a question, you can raise your hand with the little feature there, and then I'll be able to call on you from then, and you can unmute yourself at that point. So do we have any questions from the audience at this time? Okay, as you think of some, I do have a question. So as you've been talking, first of all, wow, that was a lot of dense information that I knew very little about. So thank you so much. That is the depth of knowledge that the two of you have together. Now I know why you do these as a team. It's absolutely amazing. So as you were talking, I'm thinking, you know, at Notre Dame, first of all, in athletics, we're doing really well. We have a head women's basketball coach, volleyball coach, and now football coach. And so I'm thrilled with the work that Jack is doing and all of his team, and many of them are on the call right now. But beyond athletics, you know, you had mentioned that it's the right thing to do, it's the best thing to do. There's a business case model for diversity. How can we continue to influence managers to hire more diverse teams beyond athletics, like across campus or in corporations?
Jeremy, let me start first. So this is probably more of a why than a how, but you know, I've sat on a few panels with Paul Tagliabue, who this rule could have easily been named the Tagliabue rule as well as the Rooney Rule. When he was commissioner, you know, he really stepped up, as Jeremy described, and you know, didn't take these gaps or these problems lightly. You know, he addressed them in specific ways, including moving the Super Bowl out of Arizona, which sounds somewhat simple, but is not simple at all to do that at the risk of a whole lot of lawsuits and logistical challenges, because Arizona back in the 90s, I think it was, wouldn't celebrate Martin Luther King Day. And so over and over again, Commissioner Tagliabue, you know, showed his advocacy. And so he always says, look, if and let's pretend I'm on the panel with him, if Jim and I are totally wrong, you know, if everything we say is wrong, there's one reason you should do this. And he said, the market is going to dictate. Do you want to, you know, provide services, you know, connect with, be able to engage in a population that is going to look different than what it has, that consumers are not all going to be, you know, driven by white men in the future. And do you want to function, you know, in the marketplace that folks are going to demand a better understanding of who they are, products and services that relate to them and mean them. And so I don't want to dismiss all the technical sides. You know, myself, Jeremy, my father, even Paul Tagliabue spent a lot of time on the technical sides, but you know, there is this why to that question that I think gets left out. And you know, if you simply want to function, in the world that we're moving towards, you want to relate and understand to people that are different than traditional buyers have been.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Jim just said, and I'll just add, in addition to serving the market, if you want to address a problem as comprehensively as possible, and that's what we do in our work, right? We address problems, we try to make things better, whatever it is that we're doing. Then it's important to have different types of minds, different people looking at the problem. If you just, we can just a quick thought experiment. You just think about it right now. If you have two people who are, let's say, of the same race, same socioeconomic experience, grew up in the same town, are in many other ways similar, and you give them a problem to solve, they are most likely, because they're coming from a similar experience, going to take the same approach to solving it. And what that means is, almost certainly, one will not be able to identify the blind spots of the other. Whereas if you have a group of individuals of different races, of different genders, from different places, growing up with different amounts of money, examining the same problem, you will have a comprehensive approach. You will have individuals identifying where others folks have blind spots. You will have synergies created from different places that would create different ways to attack a problem. You are just better situated to attack the problem. And I'm not sure that there's a reasonable retort to that. So I think if it's the case that we want to be the best, if we want to serve our customers the best, as Jim said, if we want to be as effective as we can in the market, if we want to be the best at solving problems, and then finally, and while there's no business case oriented around what I'm about to say, it's critically important, if we want to do the right thing and give every flower a chance to bloom, then we have to embrace the idea of equal opportunity.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions. Our next question from the chat, and then I see Kenny, I'll get to you in just a moment. Knowing what you know now, how might you tweak the Rooney Rule to ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion bleed into the fabric of the league?
Jim, what do you say? Would you like to take it, or would you like me to?
You start.
All right. So I would say, I don't know if this is maybe it's a tweak. One thing that neither Jim nor I mentioned is the rule has, since 2016, 2017, when I spoke of the decline, the rule has been tweaked several times by the league. It's been expanded now to a rule where you have to interview two people of color for the head coach position. And that responds to a bunch of research that indicates that, quote unquote, two in the pool gives you a much better chance of having a diverse hire than one in the pool. The idea being, if one is in the pool, it's automatically assumed that person is in the pool. They don't belong there organically. They're there because they have to be there for the rule. If you have two in the pool, that presumption kind of falls away and you tend to have more success. So that's one expansion. It's been expanded down to offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator and special teams coordinator. It's been expanded over to the business side when it comes to hiring a president for a club or an executive vice president. And I should point out that with respect to the business side, it's been expanded it applies both with respect to race and to gender. So the rule's been tweaked in many ways, and we may yet see the fruits of those tweaks, but as of the last couple of years, we haven't seen them the way we'd like to. And so whether this is a tweak or I don't know what you want to call it, but there has to be carrots and or sticks in the rule that are used. The one time that a club violated the rule and was penalized by the league was in 2003, almost 20 years ago. And since then, there have been circumstances where clubs have not followed the text of the rule, generally not, in many cases, not followed the spirit of the rule, but in some cases not followed the text of the rule. The league has not punished them. And nor has the league incentivized clubs who have done really well with financial considerations or draft pick considerations. So I think if the rule is going to be as effective as we want it to be, as we need it to be, there must be a strong carrot and or a strong stick in the rule, such that a club is incentivized, either in a positive way or negative way, that, hey, this is a rule that we have to attend to.
Jim, anything to add?
Let's keep moving with questions.
Okay.
I think some of my responses might get met in them.
Okay, let's go to Kenny.
Thank you. So this is going to go to Eric, the question you asked earlier, and then tie into what we're talking about right now. So the rule in itself, the foundation of it is a great rule, which we all can, I'm sure, agree on that. But at the core, I guess one of the holes in it, the people that are at the top of these organizations, who educates them to better appreciate the need for the diversity within itself? Because rules can be put in place, you can incentivize, but there's already a lot of incentives to do these kind of things. So who helps educate the people that makes billions of dollars to pay these men? Like, who does that? And then I know we're bringing back to what you said earlier, Eric, it's great that we want diversity, but who's comfortable enough to go get the kid from Atlanta, Georgia that don't speak like people from Notre Dame? Everyone's not comfortable to go hire someone like me. So how do we? I just got lucky, I got lucky, whatever it may be. But how do we educate people to help them to see the value that I bring when I don't speak like I went to Notre Dame or Harvard or wherever else people in schools like this might gravitate towards? So who's comfortable enough to critique those individuals at that level to say you're flawed in your own views or misunderstandings or shortcomings? Like, who does that?
Penny, that is a fantastic question. I'm probably not going to give you a satisfactory answer, but it is a question that needs to continue to be raised, because there isn't a simple answer, and the response is that we have to keep asking the hard question. And I'm patting my father on the back here a little bit, but force people to find their courage. My father was willing to be challenged and find courage when he was challenged. Some people aren't going to rise to the occasion, I know, but I do think that if we let the question go, no one will, well, I don't want to say no one will rise to the occasion, but you're going to have a lot fewer people rise to the occasion. So your willingness to step up here, to do this, to have this conversation, and then get into the depth of like you said, I know of examples where, a minority person, went to an Ivy League school and got a top job, and a scout a general manager's job, a scout who I know was absolutely a better scout, who comes from a town in Pittsburgh called Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, and doesn't have that Ivy League polish, that Notre Dame polish, didn't get the job. And I can't speak to why, if that was the determination, but there's no question in my mind it played a role. So I think your question is so important. And the one response I give that is not about answering the question, but I think is the comment that we have to keep in mind is you can't legislate ethics. The rule is important, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not the answer. It's a tool, but the answer has to be further. We have to challenge ourselves. We have to find intrinsic motivations, but I also think we have to create a willingness, around the system that that says, hey, I'm not gonna watch anymore. I'm not gonna, as much as I love football, if people who look like you, Kenny, aren't being respected, the one thing that I know NFL owners, we're not all the same, but the one thing they all respond to is money. So if people vote with their feet, that will have an impact. Great question, and thank you for raising it.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, that is a fantastic question. I think with respect to who can be involved in convincing the brass at NFL clubs that diversity is important. So one organization that seeks to play that role is the Fritz Pollard Alliance, which Eric mentioned, which I was counsel to for many years, and John Wooten, who I mentioned, was the chairperson of for many years. That organization had substantial influence, outside kind of watchdog organization, and John would call every day of the week. He was on the phone with an owner or a team president, just talking about the importance of equal opportunity and diversity. So I think you have to have, now, and as I pointed out earlier, John has retired, and so there's a little bit of a vacuum there. The organization still exists. Rod Graves is the executive director, former GM in the league. He's doing a great job, but nobody can really fill John's shoes. And so you've got to have that outside pressure, I think. And then the other piece, and maybe it's a bit of a longer runway piece. So one thing is convincing people that, convincing the top decision makers that diversity is important. Another is trying to make sure the top decision makers are diverse themselves, and that maybe they see that diversity is important. And so that speaks to the piece of the Rooney Rule that I mentioned, where you now have to interview a person of color and a woman for president position. So the Rooney Rule is seeking to be effective there. But it's also the case that, in Brian Flores' lawsuit, he requests, and I'll turn into a legal nerd just for about 30 seconds, but he requests unspecified damages, which is monetary damages. But he also requests, if he's successful, programmatic relief. And programmatic relief requires an organization to change systemically in some way. And he seeks programmatic relief that would result in greater diversity among club presidents and top decision makers, as well as a proposal that would impact the addition of new owners to the league in a way that would make it more likely there'd be diversity among owners. Now, that's a hard thing to do because of the financial requirements to be an owner in the National Football League and the systemic discrimination that's resulted in people of color not having as much money as a general matter across the board as people who aren't of color. So that's a longer runway thing. But I think, Kenny, you want to think about it in two ways. How do we convince the people who are currently in those roles that this is important? And how do we work to make those roles open to more people such that they can, such that it can kind of drop down instead of top up, instead of bottom up, be top down.
All right, thank you. Great question, Kenny. All right, we'll go back to the chat. In developing policy or rules like this, how do we ensure we can move beyond intention and also focus on the impact? What are some leading practices to ensuring equity in the policy development process?
Jerry, you want to speak to the technical side of the rule?
So, yeah, Eric, go again with the call of the question, the last piece of it.
What are some leading practices to ensure equity in the policy?
Sure.
Or the policy development process.
In policy development, sure. So the first piece of that, in my view, is ensuring that those developing the policy are themselves diverse. And so you have to make it your business, I think, to ensure that the policy development comes from, as I described previously, a broad set of different minds. So let's go back to the Rooney Rule's creation, the creation of that policy. There was an owners committee chaired by Dan Rooney. And because at the time, there were no owners who were of color. Now we have the owner of color in Buffalo, Kim Pagula, the owner of color down in Jacksonville, Shad Khan. But there were no owners of color. And so there was no way for that group to be a diverse, racially diverse group. But the owners group worked in tandem with an executives group. So top executives at many of the clubs. And that group was diverse. And so what you had was a diverse set of individuals working to construct the policy. And when you are constructing a policy, you have the power to put whatever minds you want on it. And so what I would say is it's critical that when you're constructing a policy, you take time, you're attentive, and you get a broad group of folks who are thinking about the policy, thinking about how it can be implemented, thinking about how indeed it might be contravened, to make sure that you are in a place you get the best policy that you can. So those would be my thoughts. But Jim, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's interesting, and maybe this gets to some other questions, and we can get deeper into it at that point. But you know, the analytical mind asks that question, and I respect that. Where I saw real change with the Steelers was, you know, in the effect of culture, and culture is you know, much harder to sort of empirically measure. I mean, there are certainly measurements for it, but I don't totally trust all the empirical measures around culture, because one, it's not static. It's something that's fluid, and my father understood that. And second, you're dealing with things that aren't the measurables, you know, emotional intelligence, conscientiousness, you know, respect for dignity. And so I'm all for measures. I'm all for outcomes. We need to have that as part of the conversation. But for them to stick, for change to really matter and sustain itself, you know, you need to transform the culture. And look, we're talking about the NFL, and the Rooney Rule has sort of put this, you know, target on the NFL as a place we should have this conversation, and that's great. You know, I'm glad of that. And as hard as it is to see my family, my father's name, you know, be somewhat criticized, you know, I saw how he did things, and you know, we're what, about 9%. You know, the NFL head coaches are African American. It's 1% of CEOs across the country. You know, we can give an example of the Steelers organization, but I want to see Amazon. I want to see Google. You know, I want to see these massive future employers embrace these elements of culture in ways that I saw. You know, the ability to have the brotherly love that Mel Blount would talk about in our locker room, and the way that these players showed that respect for each other, while also achieving the highest standards, that both are possible. You know, you can be decent, you can have, you know, a sense of love in the community that is meaningful, that respects this difference, and still be the best. And that those types of cultures, you know, I think there's elements of those, especially in some of the new tech cultures, but I think it's something, you know, we need to invest in as much as the policies, because if we come up with a perfect policy, which we probably never will, but if we come up with really good policies, we want it to sustain, and it's going to sustain because the culture has embraced that. And again, I go back to Jack's leadership. And when you look at what's going on with Notre Dame, you know, not just with race, but with the amount of women in positions of power and influence throughout the athletics department, you know, I've seen that for years, and that is a culture that I hope and believe, and someone who's you know, not super close, but pays attention to the sports world. You know, Notre Dame is a leader. You know, always been a leader in culture, but a leader in diversity and culture. And we all need to do better, but we all need to. It's good to have some good examples of folks who have stepped forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'll jump to another question. Why do you believe that an African American has not stepped forward to purchase an NFL team, to be that voice to make change in the owner's room?
You want to go, Jim, or can I?
Well, let me, since I've been in the room some,
yeah.
You know, look, it goes to what Jeremy said, and it is historic, and I think institutionalized racism. I mean, the fact of the matter is, you know, you need around $1 billion in cash to buy an NFL team, and you know, we as a society haven't created a whole lot of opportunities for women or minorities to make $1 billion. And there's certainly examples out there, and I would love to see some of them become partners, but it's a very, very small audience that would have the potential to join. So it's important that some of the league rules are changing a little bit where you can build a group, but it's still not a simple thing to do. And the reason it hasn't been done, really has to do with the fact that we needed to move further so that there are more folks who look, who come from different experiences, different race, different cultures, different genders, who have made those types of fortunes and can make decisions, of that nature.
Jeremi, anything to add? Yeah, I would just say, Jim said everything I was going to say. He's better qualified to say it than I am, so I'm glad that he said it. I mean, I would say that there are some rumors that there's an individual of color looking at the Denver Broncos, and so maybe we will see that before too long. But as Jim said, the pool of individuals who have the capital to do this, and it's unleveraged liquid. It's necessary. That you have to show, just folks know. So it's it's not, a bunch of real estate that's not going to do it. And the number of people who have that much liquid who are of color is just so small that it's just Oprah Winfrey could do it. And in fact, I know that she's been reached out to do it. And thus far, she's not indicated interest as far as I know. But there aren't that many people who are in a position to do it.
Seems like I saw an article that said Byron Allen is trying to, maybe he's the one that's looking at Denver. I'm not sure. All right, I have another question. IT is also a notoriously white male field. While some great improvements have happened in the field over the last decade or so, there's still an issue of being able to get qualified and a qualified and diverse field. How can a career field or university attract more diverse group of candidates?
Well, you have to work at it. The core of the Rooney Rule actually came, and now my mind went blank. But it was around the promotion of Colin Powell to a general in the United States Army. And Jer, who's the general in charge?
Secretary of the Army was Clifford Alexander.
Clifford Alexander was given a list of I don't know, 10, 20 people who were to get their stars. And he rejected the list. He said, there is no way that I spend all this time traveling around the world and seeing the fantastic work of our soldiers. And you can't tell me that there isn't one Black man that is qualified to get that star. And so he forced a change in an organization that certainly has a institutionalizing things is what they do, and he forced that change, and it took work, and so if you are in a hiring position, it's what the Rooney Rule is trying to respond to, and we can improve the rule, we can criticize the rule, that's all good, but it takes an effort. You have to go make the effort to find people who have these different experiences, and again, I'm patting my father on the back here, but it was what Bill Nunn did. Bill came in and said, Dan, you're not going to different pools of talent. I can help you do that. And they started doing that. And so, it cost more money back in the 70s. The HBCUs didn't have half of that. They didn't have a 10th probably of the tools that an Alabama or a Texas would have to even respond to recruiting. So it took more work to identify which of those players, might be qualified for the NFL, and those efforts are real. And so I think in a lot of ways, technology has become more ubiquitous for all of us, and we can access information, we can understand things. But the idea, if you are a hiring manager and you want to see this happen, one of the tools is hard work and really a clear commitment to working to identify diverse candidates.
Jeremi, anything?
Yeah, that's exactly, I agree 100%. I'll just give the example of Portland, Oregon. As I told you, it's called the Charles Jordan Standard there, and it requires that you interview a person of color, a woman, and a person with a disability. And at first blush, I think there was a sense that, oh, well, you know, how are we going to identify somebody from each of these groups? And there's a reasonable threshold you have to meet to show that you couldn't find someone from one of those groups. And so when they started going about trying to abide by the rule, they had to work really hard. And they were able to find people of color and women and people with disabilities who could legitimately and credibly throw their hat in the ring. But if they weren't put in a position where they had to do that, then they probably simply wouldn't have. And so going to Jim's point, it just takes more work. You know, it takes more work, but if you want to be the best, you have to do the work. And you're going to be the best by casting the widest net you can, because then you can get the gems you might miss out on if you're focused on a small pool of potential candidates.
Yeah, I might add like a multiple pronged approach, like recruiting in places you've never been before, but also growing your own, like getting internships, you know, from freshmen, sophomores in college, and helping them grow and develop, and then they, you know, when they graduate, hire them and keep moving them up. So recruiting, you know, is awesome, but also developing your own. And there's many other strategies as well. Another question, with the backslide in diversity hiring, where do we go from here to right that ship? And it seems like there's always some ebbs and flows in this type of work and in these types of initiatives. So how do we right that ship?
Well, I think there's two things from my perspective. So one is, I think, a sense of hope that I do carry. I think that, and I think it's kind of cool that it's actually women in the football operations. You know, we're seeing women coaches, we're seeing a lot of women scouts, we're seeing women as on-field referees, and that I think has pushed the envelope in a way that the sorry for this word because it's hard word to measure, but the energy just feels really powerful and potent at this time. So I think we're closer. I hope we are closer to you know, knocking some of these barriers down than may appear based on the last 3 or 4 years of hiring cycles. Where I might be wrong is, again, and you know, we can all pat ourselves on the back here, but it's true. You know, what Jack did, what my father did, what my brother Art did, you know, 3 white men, is say, it's okay, it's good, it's going to be better for us. We're going to be more successful with someone that looks different than me as the face of my franchise. And I think there is, you know, I think we have to accept the truth that there's a lot of reticence in that. And that needs to be broken down, you know, and we shouldn't shy away from that conversation and say, you know, it's wrong that we believe that someone that of color can do every other job, but we're afraid that we're going to get backlash from fans, or, you know, whatever it might be, whatever is driving those limitations is going to allow someone to make the decision that they know, I believe most people know, you know, are you know, erroneous ideas, you know, and so this idea that we're going to step up and say, the face of our franchise, you know, I want it to be a woman, I want it to be an African American, I want it to be, you know, someone from, you know, another minority community, but owning the reality of that is going to be leading your brand, I think does exist.
And I would just add that, you know, in terms of where we go from here, I think we have to stay committed and we have to be creative. So, you know, we've talked about, you know, that perhaps there, you know, we talk about perhaps there are tweaks to the rules, alterations that can be made to the rules, more punishments put into the rules, sure. But we can also think about other initiatives outside of the rule. I believe strongly, Jim believes strongly, that the rule is at core a very, very valuable process, and it should stay in place. But that doesn't mean it should be at the exclusion of other equal opportunity initiatives. And so there's got to be creativity in the NFL community about other initiatives. And the initiatives don't, they can be facially neutral, have nothing to do with race as a matter of fact. So an example of something that I think about a lot, I think would be substantially beneficial in this regard, is that generally speaking, when the NFL season ends on a Sunday, that next day, the Monday, everyone fires their coaches. Exaggeration, but 4 or 5 coaches might get fired on that day. And then within 2 weeks, often, they've now hired their coaches, the new ones. And they're concerned about the need to move quickly and get started on the next NFL year and get ready to scout the Senior Bowl and prep for the combine and everything else. And they're concerned that someone else will grab the head coach they want before they can get him. So there's kind of this frenzy. And what we know about human psychology is that when you have a frenzy and you have to make a quick decision, you more often than not retreat to what's comfortable. And what's comfortable, generally speaking, for an ownership group that is almost entirely homogenous, is, it's rare that a person of color is comfortable in that quick reflex moment where you've got to act and where you've got to move. Going back to the question that Kenny asked earlier or spoke about earlier, being comfortable with someone who's not like you. Well, in that moment, we tend to go for people who are like us. And so one idea would be to elongate the period during which interviews take place and not allow any hirings to happen between the end of the regular season and the Super Bowl, such that every club can be confident that they can take their time and be intentional and deliberate and cast a very, very wide net without fearing somebody's going to grab one of the candidates they may be interested in. And I think when you do that and you give yourself 6 weeks, you're less reflexive, you think more broadly, more creatively, and I think that will inure to the benefit of the quote unquote non-traditional candidate, which I think is a candidate of color or the woman candidate in this context. So to answer the question, I think that, let's be creative. Let's think about all the different ways to peel the onion to get to the goal.
Right, I have one more question. I think we have time for. It's the last one that in our list. What has been effective means to integrate diverse communities alongside efforts to ensure representation?
Well, I think that one thing, I've seen, and Jeremy talks about this so well, is, a willingness to have an experience to be in a situation of the other, that if you don't have that experience, that it is really hard to understand, and that then allows a lot of the biases that we talk about. So having this willingness to, go into an experience, assuming, and I hope we make these changes, but assuming, we're still talking about white men being managers, how do we put them in an experience that they really can gain an understanding of what it's like to be the other, and create the, I use this word emotional intelligence a couple times, create the empathy for what that experience might be like. So Jeremy, I'll turn it over to you. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about how we think that's so important for both when decisions are made, as well as how cultures can become, more embody some of the concepts we've talked about.
Sure. And you articulated it so beautifully, Jim. I'm not sure I can add more to it, but I think, Jim and I talk a lot about this idea that until you have been, walk a mile in someone's shoes, right? Until you have been the only person who looks like you in a room, and you have felt the subtle offenses, and you have felt being left out, being excluded from the conversation, subtly or not so subtly. Until you're in that circumstance, it can be very, very challenging for you to truly understand the obstacles that face someone who spends a lot of their life in that circumstance. And so if we can find ways, and Jim and I have talked a lot, and we're going to talk more about how these ways can be created without them being artificial and without them imposing upon a safe space by thrusting, let's say, a white man into a largely Black environment where maybe now that largely Black environment, which was once a safe space, it feels like less of a safe space to the people there. So we're working through how best to effectuate it. But I think the concept is a really, really valuable one. Once you feel that, then I think you become a more empathetic human being, quite frankly, and a more empathetic and a better leader and manager.
All right, thank you so much. We have come to the end of our time today. I want to thank Jeremi Duru and Jim Rooney. This has been an amazing discussion, and thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge, your expertise, your experiences. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. All of you, thank you for joining us today. I also want to thank Tanya and Chad, Tanya Robinson from HR, who helped set everything up on the Zoom. And then Chad is our Zoom representative here at Notre Dame, and he makes sure that everything goes smoothly. I appreciate both of you so much. Thank you. Everyone else, tune in again on the 17th for our Women's History Month program at noon, another Lunch and Learn. Thank you. Have a fantastic day and a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Best wishes
everyone.
to you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.